What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today is a solo episode with Brian and myself, and we are going to talk about some of the arguments for and against the biomechanics. I don't want to say movement, but emphasis is a really good term to use. Emphasis that has been placed on a lot of exercise selection and, most importantly, performance that has been floating around the last couple years, but has really kind of, from my standpoint, come to head here in 2020, definitely on places like Instagram and TikTok. And we're just going to give our perspectives on some of the arguments for and some of the arguments against, given the experiences and money that we have spent ourselves on learning some of it. Before we get into that, as always, Brian is going to kick us off with some updates. What is going on?
Yeah, man. You said 2020. So I would say that you probably meant 2022, but also maybe it was like a Freudian slip, because 2020 is kind of when it all started, where I think the biomechanics stuff really began to become more prominent as N1 kind of moved into the spotlight and stuff like that. So yeah, probably just a bit of a Freudian slip there. But regarding my updates, I was telling you off air, I just had like an awful night of sleep last night. My wife got back from a 4-day business trip. She's sick. Then my kid woke up in the middle of the night with a bad dream. And I think I was probably up every hour between like 9:30 and 4:30 when I finally like got up out of bed and started preparing for this podcast. So, took some caffeine and I'm here. But one interesting thing about it kind of relates to sleep and body weight and just, general well-being that I think is interesting. Probably don't know exactly that I think you're going to have like an opinion on it, or that I'm not necessarily looking for feedback. I just think it's kind of interesting that so we were on Dave McConey's podcast like last weekend, and we noted that our body weight was the exact same at 196.2 or whatever it was at that point a week ago. And then for like the next 4 or 5 days, I just ate. Like I just kept eating and eating and eating. And my weight went up half a pound to 3/4 pound every day for a full 4 or 5 days. And eventually it peaked a few days ago at 199.6. And then that night of 199.6, I ate just an incredibly massive amount of food. Like it was inappropriate. And then I woke up the next morning and my body weight had dropped 2.5 pounds. So I had gone from 199.6 down to 197 flat. And I was kind of like, man, that is so wild, because there must be a massive delayed effect happening here where a lot of that accrual of body weight that just kept going. It may have been outpacing what my actual weight was. So despite the fact that I then put down 5,000 calories, my body weight actually drops 2.5 pounds the next day. And it's been dropping every day since then. So now, as of this morning, I'm back down to 195.0. So it just like decided to go up 5 pounds and then down 5 pounds, which was just like, it's just wild to me how that happens. And so I also, obviously, as you guys know, take my HRV and my heart rate and all that stuff each morning. And on one of the days where I just completely overfed myself, I ended up sleeping the best that I've slept in a long time. So the complete contrast to the way I slept last night, which was just awful. I basically woke up once, woke up the next morning feeling great. And my HRV was like super duper high, and my resting heart rate was 41. And so it's the resting heart rate that I'm most interested in, because it's been since I've been like when I was dieting and in the low 180s, body weight or heart rate was always in like the high 30s or low 40s when I would wake up in the morning. But since I've been adding body weight, not surprisingly, my morning heart rate has been 48, 49-ish range, like higher as you would expect, right? So then for me to eat all that ridiculous amount of food and then wake up in the morning at the heaviest body weight I've been in 2 or 3 years and have this like complete calm feeling, and I could like feel it in my breathing. And then to see a heart rate of 41 was just super surprising to me, and kind of adds a level of confusion, because I thought that I had this thing figured out. Like, hey, higher body weights, higher resting heart rate, lower body weights, lower resting heart rate, all these things. So anyway, I don't know exactly if you have any thoughts on that, but I just thought that was all super interesting.
I do have thoughts, of course. The first thing I will say is with the resting heart rate, it's something that I will use with clients when we are trying to figure out, because like sometimes with clients, and this is really helpful for other coaches out there listening. You're going to get a client that comes to you and they're like, a male, let's say 5'10", roughly our size, 185 pounds. He's like, well, 2,300 is my maintenance calories. And like the short end of it is like, no, the fuck it's not. You know what I mean? And one of the things that I will use is like a resting heart rate and sometimes often a basal body temperature in the morning. And we will monitor those to see what they are. Because if they're coming in like the low 40s, like mid 40s, even high 40s, and it's someone who doesn't really do much cardiovascular stuff like that, it's almost a dead giveaway that you are actually in a calorie deficit, because that is an adaptation, right? Same thing with me. Like when I'm dieting in the mornings, my heart rate will be in the 46s, 47s, 48s. And now that I'm not dieting and I'm eating more, I'm in the mid 50s, sometimes high 50s sort of thing. Like that is a very, very cut and dry sort of thing there. Or not cut and dry, but a very helpful indicator that is not directly related to like tracking your food, et cetera, et cetera. And then with what you said about like, feeding up and just being super hungry and your weight climbing, I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's probably related to something else. You could have been sick. Your body could have been fighting. You could have been having like an elevated immune response. And then that last night where everything, calmed down and you dropped the weight, you could have been dropping the inflammation related to that. And that's why you slept so good. There's just it's a lot more than calories in, calories out in acute standpoints. Over times, weeks, months, calories in, calories out works itself out, because very infrequently are we like sick for a week at a time, 2 weeks at a time sort of thing. But acute shifts and acute rapid increases and decreases in hunger are generally or related to other aspects of your biology.
Yeah, I don't think I was even hungry. I was just eating out of pleasure. It was it was like I just saw the food. I cooked a batch of brownies and it just happened. So yeah, I don't know. It's just weird, man, because like at 199 pounds, my heart rate is consistently 48, 49 every morning. And so for me to then eat all this incredible amount of food, basically peak my body weight at the highest it's been, and see the heart rate drop 8 or 9 beats per minute in the morning was just very confusing for me. But, just one of those things. It's data and you keep an eye on it and see what happens to it in the future. So other quick updates here. I have my 6-week PRP visit with the doctor today to basically assess how it's been, how it's going, if it's healing properly, all that stuff. 6 weeks is kind of the point where I'm supposed to be basically back to where I was before getting PRP, or even slightly improved. And I would say that I cannot confidently say that I'm better than where I was before PRP at this point. I think it's pretty close. So I don't know if it's going to like continue to improve, and maybe I should expect improvements over the next like 6 weeks as well. Or if that hike I did on day 4 that I talked about a number of weeks ago did in fact have like a detrimental effect on facilitating a productive, PRP response. So I'm interested to talk to the doctor about that. The good news is right now I can lift all of the weights that I lifted prior with the same range of motion that I could do prior. The thing that's frustrating to me is the paleo chair, as we call it, where you go and you sit in the bottom of a squat and you just kind of hang out down there. That's always been something that I've been very proud of, that I can just do for like 5 minutes at a time with no issue. And for years and years, I made this claim of like, hey, if you just do it 2 minutes every day for the rest of your life, then you'll always be able to do it. Because it's not like you're going to wake up at 70 and not be able to do it. And you could do it at 69, you just have to continue to do it daily. Unfortunately, that position at the very bottom, where the body is just kind of relaxed in the bottom of a squat chair, it doesn't feel great. It really tugs on the inside of my knee pretty bad. And I'm going to ask the doctor about that, because I certainly would like to get back to doing that every day and continue this idea of doing it into my 70s and 80s and beyond. So we will have to see what happens with that. let's jump over to you. I got two more quick updates, but let's mix it up here. What you got going on? You're on mute, bro.
Thank you. First big one was that I traveled this weekend to Ohio for a little bit of work, a little bit of pleasure sort of thing. But what was really cool is I reached out to two people, Adam Neff being one, who's another really, really awesome coach in the space. Side is we will have him on Eat, Train, Prosper in 2 weeks. And he was a little bit north of Dayton, where my first stop was. So went out to him and lifted in his lift lab, which is a super, super sick garage gym build out he has going on there. And that was just awesome. It was someone that I'd never met before, right? Just we, corresponded on Instagram about different things a little bit. And one thing that was really, really cool is he is exactly how I anticipated he would be, just from things I see that he puts out on, Instagram, our few kind of correspondence. And it was really cool just to like show up and pretty much meet a stranger and it just be like a very just seamless, awesome, like 2 hours we spent hanging out, just talking and lifting weights. So that was a lot of fun. And then on Saturday, I reached out to another coach that I know from Instagram, and we trained at his gym in Cincinnati, and that was a lot of fun. So I was just really, really excited that just through the coaching network and Instagram, being able to like meet up with people in real life, lift some weights, talk business, talk coaching, and just really, really enjoy, a lift together with people. As Brian, and I talk about, we've been training, by ourselves for years and years now. So it's always cool when you get to lift with other people, especially other coaches in the industry, and talk business a little bit, talk coaching. It's always a lot of fun. So shout out to both of them. I really, really enjoyed the time there.
Yeah, I'm super envious that you got to do that. I mean, just looking at Adam's gym on Instagram, if you guys don't follow him, it's Adam Neth, Neth. And his gym is insane. Like, I mean, he literally took all of the best Prime equipment and Atlantis equipment and hammer strength and basically just combined it into a garage. And I don't even know how he fits all of it. He must have like the largest garage in the world.
It is bigger than a normal 2-car garage. It was like a little bit taller, and then maybe like an extra like 3 or 4 feet wider than would be like a traditional 2-car garage.
Yeah, I mean, he's got plenty of space. Like I see him even doing deadlifts in there and stuff, and like it doesn't even look like the barbell's getting close to anything.
No, plenty. It's really cool. And then another really quick aside. So for some reason, I had thought that like the Atlantis pendulum was like the original pendulum that came out like a few years ago, or that's at least when I first started seeing it. But then when we were in the World Gym in Cincinnati, the second gym date I had, there was an old pendulum. This thing had to be at least 15 years old, but there was like no branding on it or anything, so I couldn't see who built it. But I mean, it was like beat up. Some of the joints were like not rusted, but you could tell like there's been a lot of wear and tear on it. It's definitely not. I mean, it looked like older than your traditional like hammer strength equipment that's in like every single gym across the United States. I would feel very confident saying it's at least 15 years old, maybe 20. So I was like, oh wow, that's been around a lot longer than I thought.
Was it Watson, do you think? Have you used the Watson one?
I've used the Watson. It's definitely not Watson. No, definitely not the Watson one.
Okay.
It had a counterbalance that you could like add your own weight onto how yours is.
Yeah. Interesting. Very cool. Yeah. Well, that's sweet. I mean, I guess the technology's been around a little longer than we thought,
Definitely.
Cool. Anything else?
Oh yeah. And then kind of the last one is I have been enjoying being like a little bit looser with my gaining structure, and just having a little bit more like faith in my intuition. Now, before I go into that being said, my intuition has been formatted from meticulously tracking my food for the last like 5+ years. So I don't want that to be taken out of context, but under the assumption that like there's not like a massive amount of gains that I'm going to be able to be making at this point. I just have to make sure that like I'm training, really, really hard and keeping the needle kind of moving forward. It's all going to kind of work out a little bit. I have been a little bit more flexible in that. And the thing that's really cool there, but also at the same time, like kind of frustrating a little bit, is when you're always super, super meticulous with your food selection, it does get kind of like difficult for weight to just go on, because your metabolism in biology will resist it to a degree. And it has been cool just to know like all the times invested in food selection, in really being, health first and health prioritized. Your body does kind of have your back after you spend the months and months and years, I guess, conditioning it with those, food selection choices.
Do you have any interest in taking like the Birdo approach to dieting and just trying to do it without tracking or weighing anything? And no,
No way. No way.
Okay. I kind of do. I kind of do. I think it would be a really cool personal challenge.
I guess from that side of it, I could see it, but the not knowing would drive me bonkers.
Yeah, I mean, I
Like
guess you just use subjective pictures and then the data from the scale, because he weighs himself every day and then he takes pictures every day. And I think his acute trained eye is able to use those as the data points.
Yeah, the one thing that I will say that is I feel very confident saying is a downside of me tracking my food for so long is I have lost the connection to like reading my hunger and satiety signals well. Unless I'm like starving or grossly full, I kind of just feel like this indifference in the middle sort of thing. So that would be really, really hard to tell. Because even when I'm dieting, like there's been times like this summer where I could have straight up not had my last meal and been like perfectly fine. Not really that hungry, but I'm like, well, I'm only at 2,400 calories on the day. Like I got another 400 to go. Like I'm not just going to not eat them, but I could have been fine without it.
Yeah. Interesting. I think that, so last diet I did last spring, I did the first 4 or 5 weeks without any sort of tracking or recording of anything. And then I hit a point where I was like, okay, I'm not able to do this. So I think it would be cool for me each year that I diet to try and add like a week or two onto that before I begin tracking. And then maybe in a couple of years, I'm able to do the whole like 12 to 14 weeks and get to my goal potentially without having to track. So anyway, just kind of one of those like long-term things that I think would be kind of cool to do eventually. But anyways, real quick, final updates for me. Week 3 now of the left arm experiment. And I skipped biceps the other day because I just didn't have time on Sunday. So yesterday I had to do triceps and biceps at the end of my push day. And that was that was even more of an odd feeling. Like it's odd enough to just do one, either triceps or biceps on only my left arm. But then to have this like alternating sequence of tricep, bicep, tricep, bicep, tricep, bicep type thing, my whole left side of my body was just like this pumped up, swollen thing, and then my right side just felt completely normal and chill. So that was a really odd feeling. And I actually so the other thing that I'm thinking about with this experiment is that I've had this kind of low level pervasive tightness along I guess it kind of runs along my serratus, potentially into my like lats and underneath my shoulder blade. And it's just kind of been there for 3 years. I would call it like a 0.5 out of 10 annoyance, but it is like something that I notice. And so I'm like grinding it out. I'll put like a lacrosse ball in there, or like I'll find like the edge of a counter and kind of like jam my back into it type thing. And so it is a little bit unfortunate that I'm training only my left arm and that it's also my left side that has this tightness, because after I do this left arm training each time, I feel like that tightness is a little bit exacerbated for a little while afterwards. And so I'm just going to keep an eye on that. I don't plan on stopping the experiment or anything like that. Like the tightness isn't getting worse. Just something that I think is interesting to note. So yeah, there's that. And then the final update here is that my personal program, B's program, is finishing up microcycle 5 right now. And I am approaching that point of psychological fatigue, as usually happens around this point. So my intention is to do microcycle 6, basically push my limit on everything, and then do one of my kind of deload, flush the fatigue methods. And as we've discussed on here, I'm not a huge fan of going through the motions for a week and just doing like low effort, typical deload style. So, probably take a frequency deload, some sort of small reset of sorts, change out a few movements. I like the phrase flow week, which is a week where you just do things at lower effort. It's not officially a deload. It's just kind of, hey, trying new movements, figuring out positions and setups and stuff like that. And then you can kind of have fun in the gym. So it's not just going in and going through the motions. It's actually has a purpose. So that tends to work with my psyche a little bit. And so, yeah, we have one more microcycle to go. It is slightly misleading when I say that I'm doing 6 microcycles before a deload, because each microcycle is 9 to 10 days long. So it's not like a typical 1 week microcycle like most people do. So when I finish 6 microcycles, we're looking at almost 2 months of time before kind of flushing fatigue and taking a deload. So a lot of times when people ask me about this, they're surprised how much I go to failure, how I go beyond failure, how I do these like lengthened only sets and all this stuff. But what they don't always realize is that I don't do anything that's even remotely challenging in the first like 2 or 3 weeks of each mesocycle. So like when you're starting a lateral raise at 2 or 3 RIR and you're starting a pendulum squat at like 5 RIR and you're barely increasing that week to week, like nothing actually challenging happens until week 3. So it's really just kind of building momentum in the beginning, which I think is important. Like a lot of people, I think, jump in way too quickly and heavily into their micro and mesocycles. And I think most people would be benefited long-term more by having some maybe slower build-up weeks before getting to the really hard stuff.
Just a quick question there for you. What benefits would you say, or what do you think that people would have by doing that?
Yeah, I mean, so when I was younger, beginning to train early on, that was always the kind of pervasive message from the people I was learning from. And so I think there's a ton of kind of tangible and intangible benefits, but one is getting a grasp on how quickly fatigue is accumulating. So if you just were to jump right into like the hardest, heaviest sets you can do in week 1, I think you would have a misleading representation of the stimulus to fatigue for each movement. Second, I think that it is really easy to get stuck and not progress if you don't give your body a little bit of lower effort time to kind of grease the groove, so to speak, with the movements. Like find your groove and make sure that you're creating an ability to add reps or weight week to week, which increases your body's response, but also increases your confidence in your ability to increase. So I think there's that aspect. And then there's the aspect of just doing a longer mesocycle. So like if I were to jump into the hardest, heaviest stuff immediately, I might make it 3 or 4 weeks before I would need to deload again. And in this way, we know that science has shown in so many different ways that you can get gains further from failure than we think. So it kind of, why not take advantage of that? Like, why not get 2 or 3 weeks of kind of early gains that set you up for success before you begin kind of pushing yourself to the brink on things?
Yeah, I just thought it would be a really good addition for you to add that for the listeners.
No, I appreciate that. That's awesome. Do you have anything else to add?
Nope. Let's jump into it.
Cool. So this is like a super polarizing topic. The reason that I think we wanted to talk about this is I have been seeing a lot of anti-biomechanics rhetoric across Instagram and YouTube and stuff like that. And I can relate to some of the anti-biomechanics rhetoric. And I think that a lot of that comes from the fact that some of these biomechanics people are like purposefully trying to be polarizing. It maybe is like a way of increasing engagement in their content. But when you say things like, this is not lats, or, all you need for quads is pendulum and leg extension. Like when you make really polarizing statements like that, it's going to piss a bunch of people off. And so you have people like Paul Carter that have really swung around a lot. Like he used to be one of those super polarizing biomechanics people that he was the first one that even came out with the wide grip pull down is not lats, and like very, very polarizing statements. Now he's more like, hey, the lats act in the frontal plane. The lats also act in the sagittal plane. They do adduction and they do shoulder extension and like, or shoulder depression, like all these different things. And so if you want to avoid the anti-biomechanics people coming down hard on you, then I think it's really important that you take account of the way that you relay your message to people along the way. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I mean, we're talking about it in the form of, biomechanics and anti-biomechanics, but I think it's like a micro representation of a larger thing. Like if you're going to if you're a person that makes a lot of absolute type statements, be prepared for pushback on a lot of the statements that you make. Like one of my big prevailing goals, I would say, with the podcast and my messaging is to try and not make absolute statements, because in many, many cases, there is some context that you are not considering that your absolute statement falls apart.
Yeah, for sure. So I think when we just kind of look at some of the different arguments against biomechanics, there's a few of them that all kind of basically mean the same thing, but are kind of said differently. And so like it all kind of boils down to, hey, people have been getting yoked for decades with just free weights. So what's like the first thing when you hear that? Like what is your kind of gut response to that?
It's true. It is true. People have been getting super jacked for decades with free weights. But with that, I think it is a valid statement, right? And I wouldn't use that as a jumping off point to say, but biomechanics does this. I think that is a very valid standpoint. Yeah, I mean that's the end of it. I think it's a valid argument because people have been. There are things that like, and some of our points for the listener out there are interrelated. So I don't want to like use the point here, but we will have like not a rebuttal, but an argument for that addresses my potential issue with this argument. But I think it's valid because people have been. If you like, we've all seen that dude who's like when we were younger, I feel like not to be like dads used to be more jacked back then sort of thing. But I remember seeing, when I was like growing up in high school and stuff, like that dude in his 40s who was like a blue collar dude who just had like a barbell and a squat rack in his garage and was like, 6 foot, 250, probably like 20%, 22% body fat, but pretty fucking jacked. And all he did was like overhead press, rows, squats, bench press sort of thing. So it is valid to some degree.
Yeah. Yeah. The barbell is really like the first real piece of equipment that was built, manufactured for the purpose of actually lifting it. So it's not like this innovative piece of science that is built to give you the best results possible or whatever. It's literally just a straight bar that you add shit to. So, I mean, I laugh about it because like technologically, we are so far beyond the barbell. It just is just this archaic piece of metal that, yeah, it works. If you want to just pick shit up and put it down and put your body in different positions so that you can get really strong and add muscle, yeah, a barbell works. But that I don't think anybody back in like the 1900s or whenever that was created would have chosen the barbell over something else should they have had the selection of things to use that we have today. And so a lot of that argument of it's like got to stick to the barbell basics, like the deadlift, squat, and bench and all that. Like that comes out of powerlifting for sure, but it also comes out of kind of this emotional attachment maybe to like the way things were. And it's interesting because it's not just old people in their like 50s, 60s, 70s that are like barbell, it's got to be the barbell. Like you have a lot of that from these newer, younger people coming in. And that doesn't actually surprise me because I found my roots in the late 90s in a group of people on the internet that were touting HIIT, high intensity training, not high intensity interval training. So this is a methodology for lifting weights. It was basically the idea of warming up and taking one set to absolute failure on big barbell basic movements. It was kind of not spearheaded by, but one of the big proponents of it was a guy named Dr. Ken Leistner, Leistner. And just because I was intrigued about it and wanted to have some of that nostalgia of my early days. So a couple months ago, I got on YouTube and just typed in Dr. Ken Leistner training and just wanted to kind of see like what this dude was doing that I was so infatuated with 20 years ago when I first started. And there's an hour-long video of going through like an entire workout of his. And, it starts with 20 rep squats, basically to failure breathing squats, where you get to 10 reps and you look like you're going to die. And then your back starts rounding over, but you're like still standing up and doing the thing. And then it's like, a 20 rep deadlift. And I was just like, oh my God. Like I remember doing this stuff when I was coming up. There was a book that was like the Bible of HIIT training that was called Brawn. And then there was a second one called Beyond Brawn. And that was what they advised. Like it was like choose 2 or 3 big compound basic movements. And you basically do a set of 10 to 20 reps to absolute failure until you cannot move anymore. You rest 5 or 10 minutes because that's what it takes to even begin to recover from something like that. And then from there, you move into your next movement, whatever that movement is. And so there's something about that idea of just like getting under the iron, throwing that bar on your back, putting your hoodie on, cranking up the heavy metal or whatever it is. And there's something that people really romanticize about that. And so I think there's a bit of the anti-biomechanics people that are attached to that feeling.
You are 100% accurate. I feel like this isn't the best choice of word here, but I feel like it's a pass down through a generational thing of like your traditional toxic male ego sort of thing. So many of us flirt with it at different times of our lives, but I think that's pretty much exactly what it is. Like there's a romanticize about it of like, this is what you do when you're a real man and lifting weights sort of shit. And I think there is definitely people that appeals to for sure, mm-hmm. especially when you're in the beginning.
Yeah, for sure. And it's kind of like establishing that baseline of hard work is super important. And like you and I have discussed this before, like I don't think I would take like a brand new person to lifting and start giving them like a 1-arm pull down braced against a bench. Like I just don't think that they're going to be able to get enough out of that to be able to truly benefit in like the long term from that. Like maybe if you're there in person with them and you're acutely like really hands on helping them manufacture like great technique with that and all that. But it just, I think this kind of leads me into the next argument that we get a lot from the anti-biomechanics people, which is that you just don't need to do so many movements when you do these like barbell basics or whatever the argument is, but you just don't need to do as many movements because each movement that you do is in theory like a compound movements that's training multiple muscle groups. And part of the argument you get from the anti-biomechanics people is, man, if I were to do all of these like super nuanced specific movements, I would be in the gym for hours and hours trying to isolate every single area of my body. And so maybe there's a little bit of something there as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And then you wrote a note that biomechanics optimized movements aren't as subjectively taxing. Do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah. And that's what it was like. I was listening to a podcast. I wish I could remember what it was, but they were talking about this exact, or having the exact conversation that we're having right now. And they were saying like, yeah, but like something like a cable row, it just doesn't fry you like a set of like heavy bent over barbell rows. And I agree with that, but that's because something like a heavy bent over barbell row, like you're going to have your glutes activated. There's probably even a little bit of, obviously much more bracing in the core because you're in a mechanically disadvantageous position, your erectors and different things like that. But are you doing, my kind of argument against that is like, well, what's the purpose of the barbell row? Or sorry, what's the purpose of the movement, right? So if we're doing that kind of like hollow, lean forward, lat cable row, I don't want my fucking lower back and my glutes and stuff all fried, because I want the tension in my lat, or in my lats. And maybe like how my current program is, maybe the day before I did glutes and hamstrings in that sort of thing. I don't want to hit them again because they're not recovered yet. So I think it's the subjectivity of how fried you feel, that's not inherently indicative of hypertrophy, especially potentially in the target tissues that you want. So I don't love that argument, because feeling, subjective perception isn't necessarily indicative of hypertrophy stimulus in whatever target tissue that you thought you were training.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point and well said. And I would actually say that you could go as far as to say that that feeling of actually being fatigued potentially has negative ramifications on your ability to produce hypertrophy. Like the goal of training is not to feel fatigued. You don't want to walk away from your session being like, oh man, my entire body is smashed and it was a pull day. You should feel the tension and the stimulus in the target tissue, because in doing so, you're potentially limiting the amount of total fatigue. And then when your body has all of this excess fatigue, it actually has to prioritize flushing that fatigue first, repairing the damage before it can actually build muscle. And so that kind of goes back to the soreness piece. It's it doesn't necessarily mean that because you're like a barbell basics person that you also think soreness is important. Those are not necessarily the same thing. However, they're also not mutually exclusive. And so you just don't want a ton of fatigue in your training, confusing that message to your body and making it have to prioritize that, especially that fatigue that's central through the spinal column. Like bent over rows give you a hell of a stimulus, but they come with a ton of fatigue cost. And, going back to my other point, if you have a short amount of time to train and you need to get work done in 45 minutes, 3 days a week, then yes, 100% you should probably stick to the movements that are going to be heavy hitters, because you're not going to actually be able to cause enough fatigue that your body is going to struggle to recover from that. But if you're in the gym for 75, 90 minutes, 4 days a week or 5 days a week or whatever it is, then I think at that point you shift the benefit to being more advantageous with some of these maybe more biomechanically advantageous movements.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, as we move kind of into some of the arguments for biomechanics, we sort of began to touch on that. But I think overriding, like the main thing that I thought when we first started having this conversation is everything is biomechanics. There's literally like you can be using a barbell and doing a bent over row, but if you're thinking about what you're doing as you're doing that bent over row and where your body should be in space and where your elbows should be traveling, and any of those thoughts go through your head, you are essentially using biomechanics. I mean, the definition on Wikipedia, the first thing that comes up is biomechanics is the study of the structure, function, and motion of the mechanical aspects of biological systems. So, I mean, literally, it's everything. It's everything. What do you think about that?
It is. And I think there's obviously so much you could go down the rabbit hole, like crazy deep, which I feel like, you and I have done. And then we've kind of settled into our respective middle ground of what we think makes the most sense for us personally in our journeys. But especially as coaches, what makes the most sense for the populations that we coach, in just balancing all the different aspects of it to what ends up being practical for, the audience. And that audience might be you as the lifter who's listening, or as the coach listening for the majority, or the popular demographic is the word I'm looking for, of a person that you coach and train most often.
Yeah, no, that's super, super good point. Like, I feel very lucky that we are able to have the perspective from both sides of this. Like when I look at the people that are super biomechanics proponents that are basically like parroting what Cass says and then being polarizing about it, I'm kind of like, like, I don't know how much does that really appeal to people? Like if you had a client, would you automatically push them to do these like super optimized biomechanic movements regardless of who the client is because this is your stance and you believe in this? Whereas you look at us and we're like, hey, we trained with barbells and dumbbells only for the first 2/3 of our training career, and so we understand that there is inherent benefit in a lot of this stuff, and so we're able to kind of disseminate that down a little bit and use each of these different approaches as like a tool in our toolbox.
Yeah, normally the latter. Some of that I can think of though is like, let's say I have a client who's, has my levers in frame, and he's like, Aaron, I really want to grow my quads, but he just keeps putting in like a barbell back squat. I'm going to be like, yeah, this isn't going to go how you think it's going to go. And here's like 6 years of my life of why sort of thing. So in certain ones where I know that you're making your life harder than it needs to be, and it's not going to go the way you want, I would kind of put that down. But the thing that this is like a personal kind of thing, but I like formulating my own opinions, right? I feel like that keeps me honest. And to kind of back up a little bit, or not even to support the argument for, if you find yourself being someone who's like super against it, but you've never spent the money to go to a seminar of, Cass N1 or someone else that I think does a really, really good job. I feel like Cass might crucify me for saying this, is Joe Bennett, the hypertrophy coach, because I know they don't really get along, but they have similar. There are things that they say, not everything, but some things that align decently. Spend the money, go to one of their, practicals, courses, weekend seminars, whatever, and formulate your own opinion. Because it's really easy to sit there from your, being one of those fucking armchair people. It's like, oh, that's bullshit. But then you're like not going to go, actually see what they're coaching. You're just going to disseminate whatever you want from like a 30-second, Instagram reel or whatever. And it's those people that I have a hard time not taking seriously, but like you're formulating a one-sided opinion, and you're, like if you really want to argue against something, like go see what they're actually doing and then make that argument, as opposed to not.
Mm-hmm. No, also well said. Your girlfriend, Jenny, she attended the N1 with you about a year ago. And I know you guys came over to my house and you guys were both like super amped on what you were learning and really excited about it. So now, like looking at her as an avatar, somebody that, came from CrossFit-y type background, did some bodybuilding, went to N1, kind of has her own thing going on. What's like her perspective on all that stuff now, like a year out?
She has, I mean, let's face it, Jenny's goal is like glutes. That's what she cares about. And I think for her, it's a little bit of like a middle ground, in certain of like some of it around the understanding different parts of the glutes and stuff like that were like super, super helpful. But her perspective, and what I think is really interesting with her is like Jenny trained with Brett Contreras for a while when he had his gym in PB, like right down the street from where we lived. And then obviously like him and Cass have very polarizing-esque approaches on things. And it was a really interesting, scenario for her because she was in the middle. She had trained, with Brett and then attended the N1 thing. And I think that's where some of it gets hard, because at the end of the day, what are we here for? Results. Right. And it's oftentimes like you can get the results through different paths. And a lot of the times what we're arguing, or what people are arguing, is purely from like a scientific correctness sort of thing, even though both are probably going to get you where you want to go. So oftentimes, unfortunately, it does kind of like come down to semantics. And that's what she's kind of found. Like some of the movements were just really, really hard for her to perform, and she wouldn't like feel them well. She's like very quad dominant. So in some of the like leg press with like the feet high or whatever, once she hits like a certain load threshold, she's not getting that same like glute stimulus, and she just feels it a lot more in her quads. And she had a hard time like really believing it, because she's like, everything my body is telling me is like my quads are sore, right? I can feel the stimulus in my quads. I'm not feeling it in my glutes. How much more do I want to invest of going down this route to try and get it done, where I know if I'm doing like a heavy hip thrust, I am feeling it in my glutes, and my glutes have been growing. And I think that's where that like, individual aspect comes in. But I still think like getting the knowledge and experience on both sides helps you find your own personal middle ground.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. I'm glad I asked that question about her, because it kind of brings me to another point, which is in our Paragon group, we're doing we did a glute specialization cycle last, and now we're doing a quad shoulder specialization cycle. And so the difference between the way that you would perform a movement with a quad focus versus a glute focus, like you can take the leg press or the split squat or basically any number of movements, and it's a subtle shifting of your body in space so that, you're trying to facilitate a vertical shin when you want more glute, and you're getting more knee flexion where the knee is pushing over the toe for more quad. But the interesting thing, and how it relates back to Jenny, is that in the glute cycle, I had tons of people being like, here's my video. How does it look? I'm only feeling this in my quads. And I'm like, yeah, it looks great. Like you're doing it exactly as you should for glutes, but they're feeling it in their quads. And then conversely, in this cycle, I have a lot of people doing like really good knee flexion, knees going forward. And they're like, I'm only feeling it in my glutes. And I'm like, hey, that's okay. Because the thing is, both are both. And so all we're trying to do is shift the emphasis slightly. So if you're a person that's doing it with a vertical shin for the glutes, but you're feeling it in your quads, just imagine how much quads you'd feel if you actually did it for the quads. And then conversely, if you're the person doing it for quads where your knee is going forward and you're feeling it in your glutes, well, hey, at least you're getting more quads this way than you would be the other way. And so we're always going to have these natural tendencies to feel things more in certain areas and other areas. But by executing a movement with a slight shift in the emphasis of that movement, that emphasis on the body part can also shift slightly. But when people think that, hey, we're doing a quad dominant split squat, so I should only feel this in my quads, I mean, that's, I think, where a lot of the message gets a little blurred with people.
Yeah, because it's an emphasis, not in like only thing.
Yeah.
They're like exclusivity sort of thing. Like it's just more than it would be if you performed it in a non-optimized mechanical advantage sort of thing.
Yeah. So like if you were going to be like 60-40 one way, maybe it's 60-40 the other way.
Yeah.
Cool. You froze on me there, so I missed whatever you said at the end. But
yeah, I started talking, but I just let you go with it. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Cool. And then so as we kind of continue down the rabbit hole here of the arguments for biomechanics, I think one thing we can do is kind of look at all of the research that we constantly discuss about, long muscle lengths and lengthened overload and all this stuff. And if you aren't at least aware of some of the principles of training with biomechanics, then you will have difficulty actually finding where the muscle is most lengthened. And so a perfect example of this being like a lot of the anti-biomechanics people are like pull-ups for back. That's all you need. Just do pull-ups for back and you're good. And I think in many ways, if you just do a ton of pull-ups with different variations, supinated, neutral, overhand, you manipulate your chest position in relation to the bar and you become like super proficient at doing pull-ups, you probably can get relatively decent development across your back doing pull-ups. But just the idea of shifting your chest position in relation to the bar or changing your grip or your elbow position, like that is biomechanics. And so if we have this I don't know how far I want to take this, but we have this idea that the lats aren't as active as you get above 120 degrees of shoulder flexion. So if we're 90 degrees here, if you're watching YouTube, you're in luck. If not, oh well. But like my arm is basically parallel to the ground here. And then as it comes up, if it gets directly over my head, like it would be at the bottom of a pull-up, that stretch that's occurring isn't actually stretching the lats as much as it's stretching like the teres and like some rear delts and mid traps and stuff like that. And so if we then, to go back to my point, if we want to prioritize the length and position and stretch the lats as much as possible, regardless of whether that's going to give you 1% or 2% improvement in your results or no improvement, it might just be a good idea to know these things for your own body and to understand that, hey, when you reach your arm across your body, you can actually legitimately feel the stretching of that kind of lumbar iliac lat region. And you just don't necessarily make that same connection to your body if you were to just do like, hey, pull-ups all the time, bro, like builds backs of the Navy SEALs. Like, why do we need to do more than that type thing?
Yeah. And that in it itself. So there was one, I'm trying to check the list we have here. That specific thing that you just talked about was the biggest takeaway for me. And okay, so I see the note here, improved program design. So before N1, and this was my personal, I'm not saying like they're the only ones doing it. I do believe they do it well for what it's worth. I didn't understand the lengthened and shortened stuff quite to the level that I really should have. And that was reflected in my program design as well. So for instance, something like when I was putting together a back's a bad example, but let's say like a bicep or something like that. It may have been a day that had only like short overloaded movements because I just didn't know. All I knew was exercises. And I didn't understand how some exercises are overloaded in the length and position, mid-range, short range. But if you don't understand it, and let's say you program like, I don't know, like a spider, a spider curl, and then you do like what do people call it? Like the cable curls where you're in the rack and you're it's another shortened overload movement.
Yeah.
I don't know the name of it. Sorry. It's like your arms are out at a T and you're standing in the middle of the cable rack and you're curling up.
Your triceps are humerus is parallel to the ground, so triceps are parallel to the ground. You're basically doing the flex position, like if you were doing like a bicep flex.
Yeah, like a high cable curl or whatever. So like you do that, and then you do like what's another like shortened overload bicep movement?
Yeah, like a spider curl or a concentration curl or something like that.
Yeah, and then you do like a concentration curl, right? Those are your 3 bicep movements. Like they're 3 movements all training the same exact position,
Yeah.
And let's say you do, I don't know, 3 sets of each, which is a lot, but 9 total sets. You could probably get the same, if not a better stimulus out of half of the volume by incorporating like a incline cable dumbbell curl or a face away cable curl or something like that, just by knowing like, hey, these are going to train more at the length and position. It's harder, right? And it provides a more like robust overall stimulus. So like the biggest takeaway for me was just program design. Mm-hmm. And one thing, just kind of taking it back to previous years of my own personal training, there'd be days where I'd have incredible pumps, incredible stimulus. And then there'd be other days where I'm like, fuck, why isn't it like, those other days? And it's just like, I would just chalk it up to like, oh, it's just in the ether. I don't know. It's just like, wasn't meant to be today. But like, no, there's a reason why. There's a science behind these sorts of things. And, and it just helps you eradicate that, not randomness, but like, oh, like the planets aligned and I had this incredible leg day. Like that would happen to me. It would happen. Then I wouldn't see it for like 4 months again. Like now I know why. And I can recreate that twice a week when I go train. And like, lo and behold, my worst body part is now finally growing now that I'm in my mid 30s, better than it ever has. Coincidence? No, it's not a coincidence. So I think like that was been the biggest argument for is just improved program design and understanding better exercise selection and their place inside a program.
Yeah, no, totally well said. And I want to kind of just go back to something you said in there, which kind of you alluded to about, your total volume needs based on exercise selection. And so this sort of the idea of training at short and long muscle lengths is certainly like a principle of biomechanics, like the length tension relationship and the force velocity curve and all that stuff. Like that all has roots in biomechanics, but the practical application for somebody listening is that, hey, instead of doing 9 sets of biceps of like you said, we'll go concentration curl, spider curl, and high cable curl, right? Like instead of doing those 3 movements for 3 sets each, you could probably get away with doing half to 2/3 of the total volume if you shift some of that emphasis to lengthened. So now we're back to that argument that the anti-biomechanics people had, which was, you don't have to do as many exercises because all of these movements are like so taxing, right? If you just do your bent over rows and your bench presses and your squats and your deadlifts and whatever, then you're good to go. And it's kind of a similar argument for the biomechanics, because at the end of the day, we're just trying to not waste energy on shit that we don't have to do. Like we don't have to do 9 sets of these bicep curls when we could do 3 sets short overload and 2 sets lengthened overload and probably get similar or the same, like around the same benefit that you would get, say, doing 9 sets of short overload. And I'm just making these numbers up, but you don't have to do as much when you're putting the muscle under more tension at those long muscle lengths. And so, like we've discussed before, free weight movements tend to have a lengthened bias, which I think is part of why they've been so effective for so many decades. Like we referenced on another episode, but other than bicep curls with the free weight, which are probably more like a mid-range movement, short mid-range. But other than that and back movements, every other free weight basic barbell movement you would do is basically a lengthened movement. And so I think the anti-biomechanics argument oftentimes doesn't think about it from that perspective.
Yeah, and that was something that I figured we would kind of rope that up at the end of it, but that I do think ends up being a little bit more coincidence for the argument against. It's like all you need is the barbell movements, so it's like, well, coincidentally, an overwhelming majority of the barbell movements are all lengthened overload, which happens to be like why they are so effective. But yeah, like that, I think that is like a very fantastic full circle description right there. And I do think it ends up, when people say that, it's kind of funny because it's like they're making an argument against, but it's also the reason you can make that argument is because of, the actual science in it is rooted in the biomechanics because they are lengthened overloaded sort of thing. So yeah. It's funny, but it is a bit of a coincidence there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that was well said. So I have like 3 more interesting points here to make on the topic, and then we can kind of wrap this thing up as it's been going on a little bit. But when it comes to these biomechanic movements, one of the questions I like to ask is, what is the opportunity cost of doing that movement? And so what I mean by that is, like, a lot of times you get the anti-biomechanic people that are like, they'll say, the iliac lat pull down isn't just working the iliac lats, it's working everything. And so then the response is like, okay, cool. So let's say I am going into this and I assume that I'm working my iliac lats mostly because I'm doing this like high to low 1-arm pull down or whatever against a bench. Let's assume that it doesn't just work my iliac lats. Let's assume that worst case scenario, it's just a pull down. Okay, cool. It's just a pull down. Then it's basically the same as doing a pull up or a pull down or whatever it is. Like if it's not specific to my iliac lats, then worst case scenario, it's the same as what you would do anyways. So I think that in many cases, if people were to just try stuff, maybe it ends up actually having some of these really cool long-term benefits on the productivity of their training. And that leads me into my next point, which is minimizing joint issues, which have been non-existent since adopting more of these biomechanically style what am I even trying to say right now? Advantaged biomechanic movements. So as we've discussed many times on the podcast, when we were doing these barbell basic movements, we constantly had joint pain in the knees, elbows, shoulders, things like that. And now we just don't. And so it makes me think in some ways that more people should adopt biomechanically advantaged movements as their training journey goes on. Because the majority of people that I see, and most of this comes from powerlifting, so it's maybe not like a fully fair comparison because they are lifting for performance instead of aesthetics, but they are, a perfect epitomized example of what happens when you do barbell movements only. Most powerlifters are pretty ragged and torn up by the time they reach their 40s and 50s. And you don't always see the same thing with bodybuilders, especially ones that are intelligent bodybuilders and know their bodies and adapt their movements along as their age increases. And I just happen to see this a lot, with the anti-biomechanics people. They tend to be people in their 20s, late 20s, maybe early 30s, but they're young people whose bodies haven't maybe given them that signal yet. And I think it would be interesting to follow some of these like really outspoken anti-biomechanics people in 10 years and see if their views are still the same as they are now.
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up. Like the longevity aspect is huge. And like you said, it's kind of I feel fortunate because like before, like I was one of these people. It wasn't anti-biomechanics. I just didn't know anything about it, to be completely honest. And I trained all the heavy barbell movements and stuff, and I was really beat up. And the thing that's really interesting is when you have a lot of like joint pain and inflammation and stuff, it's really daunting to come in and get warmed up to be like, all right, I got heavy triples on the squat today, and your knees are just hurting you with an empty barbell on your back.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very big climb psychologically. And just from a straight desire standpoint, when you feel like dog shit to try and go in and move near maximal loads. And then at the same time, you're only digging the hole deeper. It's not like the day after you wake up, you're like, oh man, my knees feel great now. Like, no, they fucking feel worse.
Mm-hmm.
And as I switched with some of these things that I learned, like I'm 34 now, and I've talked about this on the podcast before. I feel much better than I did at 24 from a joint standpoint, and in that it reduces the barrier for the enjoyment and desire to get into training your training sessions when you don't feel really beat up. And that, as you age, like Brian said, is big. Just keeping you in the game is a really, really big part of it.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so I think that when it really comes down, like I saved that for last because of all of the arguments that exist that we've covered over the last hour, the way that my body feels performing these movements and the longevity that I foresee as a result of utilizing these movements it makes the entire thing worth it. And so, yeah, that's really the way I feel about it. And then just to kind of wrap up to one final point, the anti-biomechanics people, we started this conversation saying that their main argument is, people have been getting yoked for decades with just a barbell. And so my question is it's just a food for thought question, but how do you know they wouldn't have been more jacked with different movements? And you can't actually know that because they only have this experience. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the best route is probably a combo of both. You got to work hard. You got to do the stuff that teaches you that work ethic, how to get close to failure, how to push through barriers, and what it feels like to lift heavy weight off the ground or sit down with heavy weight on your back. But once you've kind of learned those lessons, you just don't know whether your body would have been better long term should you have adopted those movements earlier on. And it's something we'll never know. It's just kind of like a thought experiment.
Yeah. I don't unfortunately think we ever will know. And like you said, to kind of wrap this one up, for you listening to this podcast, the answer is going to lie somewhere in the middle. And that is going to be different for every single person. And it will probably, I shouldn't even say probably, very, very likely move along that spectrum depending on where you are in your lifting career. When you're younger and your joints don't have as many miles on them, like you can put miles on them fast and you're not going to run into any issue until you do. And then you will probably slide more towards the arguments for biomechanics side for purely longevity and to keep you in the game, which is the ultimate goal.
Yep. Well said.
Anything else you want to add on to the end of this one, Brian?
No, man, we're good. Yeah, I think that actually went super well.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was a really, really good episode. As always, guys, thank you for listening. Any follow-ups or anything, you can feel free to ping Brian or I on Instagram, and we will talk to you next week.